Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jessica, and I am with Family Source Consultants. I have the immense privilege of being joined this evening by Natalie Gamble of NGA Law and Dr. Guy Ringler of California Fertility Partners. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem.
Thank you for inviting us. Happy to be here.
Great. So this evening, or it's evening in the UK, afternoon in California for you, Dr. Ringler. But we wanted to get together and talk a little bit about the intended parent process, particularly focusing on intended parents from the UK. And before we get going, I just wanted to ask if you could briefly introduce yourselves, because while I could introduce you and read off all of your accolades, it's always nice to hear a little bit about your backgrounds from yourselves, and particularly as it relates to our wonderful British intended parents and helping them through their surrogacy journeys. So Natalie, could you start?
Sure. So my name's Natalie Gamble. I'm a solicitor from the UK. I run a law firm called NGA Law, which is the UK's first and only specialist fertility law team. We deal with lots and lots of surrogacy cases, lots of parents going overseas. In fact, we helped the very first parents to go overseas in 2008 and come back and get their parentage recognised in the UK. I'm also the co-founder with my wonderful business partner, Helen, of Brilliant Beginnings, which is a non-profit surrogacy agency here in the UK. And we help project manage with parents going to the US. So not just helping with the legal side of things, but also all of the budgeting and planning and project management and everything else that they need to think about as well. So we absolutely love building families through surrogacy in a really kind of good and ethical and legal way. And it's really lovely to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
No problem. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to join us. And Dr. Ringler, it's always a pleasure to see you and chat with you. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about your background and particularly your experience working with British intended parents?
Sure. I'm a fertility specialist with California Fertility Partners in Los Angeles, where I've been practicing for 30 plus years. And we've always been considered a global fertility practice. And we're dedicated to helping people have babies and build families. Our IVF center was responsible for the second IVF baby and the first frozen IVF baby in the United States, almost 40 years ago today. And we helped create some of the world's first gay families through egg donation surrogacy. So we've always been on the map, and we've always been considered, a top fertility center because my senior partner, Richard Mars, is one of the founders of IVF. And so we've always seen patients from around the world who seek us out for our expertise in all things IVF. So we've been seeing patients from the UK and Europe for many, many years.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you, with both of you. The experience and the to put it bluntly, the impressive resumes of both of you personally and professionally, but also the people that you work with, and the clinics and the law firms that you founded have helped so many people. And as an intended parent myself, I just want to thank you for the work that you guys have done to forge the way for intended parents across the world and in the UK. It's wonderful how many families you have both helped to create and to make safe and stable and to bring back. So the joy that you have spread throughout the world is wonderful. And it's always a pleasure to talk to both of you. So I don't want to take up a huge amount of your time or our wonderful viewers. Now, for our viewers who are watching and joining us live, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions for either Natalie or Dr. Ringler, please feel free to post them. They'll come up and we're happy to answer them. Obviously, for anybody who is watching this recorded, so after we put it on our YouTube, we will have contact information for myself, for Natalie, and for Dr. Ringler. So if you have any questions after this has gone on live, I guess, we'll still be very happy to answer them. But let's get started if we can. So the first question I have is for both of you. And clearly, you both work with lots of intended parents in various jurisdictions. So what is it about the US that you think is particularly advantageous for British intended parents wanting to do surrogacy. Natalie, if I could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the UK, unlike many other European countries, isn't a place where surrogacy is prohibited entirely. So people do have the option of choosing to go through surrogacy here in the UK or to look overseas. But there are some really significant limitations if you need the help of a surrogate here in the UK. So, firstly, there's a big shortage of surrogates because of the way the legal framework works and the fact that surrogates are, in theory at least, not able to be compensated more than expenses. There are restrictions on how agencies can recruit. And there's also the fact that surrogacy arrangements here in the UK are not legally recognised. So the surrogate is always initially the mother, and lots of intended parents worry about the risk that's involved in entering into a surrogacy arrangement with someone without any legal certainty. So if you contrast that with the US, what you are able to access there is a very secure surrogacy arrangement where it's all dealt with very upfront. You can put agreements in place. Everybody's very clear about what they're doing. And when you go into that arrangement, you know that you're going to be the legal parents of your child. So I think that feels very safe and very clean for intended parents. There's also, of course, the huge experience of professionals in the States. So many agencies and attorneys and clinics that have been doing this for a really long time. And they know kind of it's going through surrogacy, in particular, I think international surrogacy is like this massive jigsaw puzzle, and you need to kind of get every piece of the puzzle right, and it all needs to fit together right. So I think being able to draw on that professional experience that's much more lacking in the UK, that's the reason that so many people choose to go to the States.
Brilliant, thank you. And Dr. Ringler, why do you think that the US is a great destination for international, but specifically British intended parents?
I think, as Natalie said, we have this breadth of experience with surrogacy here in the United States, particularly in California. We've been helping couples, patients from the UK for nearly 30 years to have babies through surrogacy because the laws are very safe, very well established, and the protocols are all in place. When we do surrogacy, it's very important that we have our government required infectious disease screening tests done on the egg provider, sperm provider, and those are all done. But in the IVF clinic, we need those test results to be done before the embryos can be transferred into the surrogate. So it's always ideal to work with an IVF clinic that has experience in surrogacy, that knows how to do all the required testing, so everything is in place to make the cycles go smoothly. I think in addition, since the start of IVF, the United States has been one of the leaders in IVF technology, IVF success rates. So we have some of the best top IVF programs in the world actually in the United States today. So it gives patients from abroad an opportunity to have their embryos grown in the ideal environment that our laboratories provide. And most patients today elect to do genetic screening of their embryos to tell if they're chromosomally normal or abnormal. That includes knowing the sex of the embryos, which is helpful for patients in their family planning. And that's one piece of information that's not available to patients in the UK in particular.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, you mentioned a few points there in terms of genetic screening, in terms of some of the required tests. If you don't mind, could I ask you to elaborate? So these genetic tests, which are the FDA panels, not genetic tests, the infectious disease FDA tests, could you share a little bit more about those, what they're for, why they're required, and when intended parents should be doing them?
Sure. All patients before doing IVF are required to do infectious disease screening results. But for individuals utilizing surrogacy, we have these specially labeled tests we call FDA screening labs. They're infectious disease panels that have to be run in the United States in our government-approved assays for donor screening. And the purpose, of course, is to protect surrogate from any transmission of any infection. For the egg provider, we need to run these FDA screening labs within 30 days of the egg retrieval. For the sperm providers within 7 days of providing the specimen that will be used to inseminate the eggs to create the embryos. So these tests are usually done when the patients arrive in the United States to start their treatment cycle. For the male patient, we can obtain them at the time of sperm freezing. So for many of our male patients, we'll travel to the US, freeze their sperm, do our FDA infectious disease screening panel, and then that frozen sample is used to disseminate the eggs in the actual IVF cycle. So it enables them to, to get the FDA screening labs out of the way, the sperm ready prior to the actual treatment cycle.
Fantastic. And that's really important because it's something that, although a lot of parents who have maybe gone through an IVF cycle overseas, they will have done similar infectious disease screening tests. Those are different, or they're not accepted by the US government. So they need to specifically do these FDA panels. Is that right?
Yeah, these infectious disease panels have to be run in the US. They have to be run on our government approved assays for donor screening.
Okay. And is it ever possible, if intended parents have created embryos abroad, that they would like to utilize for surrogacy in the United States? Is that ever possible with these FDA tests? Could you share a little bit more about that?
It is possible. It is a little bit of a puzzle because the sperm provider has to have his blood drawn, urine collected within 7 days of providing the specimen, and that those specimens need to be FedExed to the US because they have to be run in the US, of course. Yeah. And the same for the egg provider. So as long as we're able to get these, blood and urine samples, in time before while the assays can still be run, it is possible. But in that scenario, the patients are creating embryos in the UK versus the US, and so this is my bias, but I think they miss out on the ideal and IVF laboratory conditions that are available in the US, And so everything that we do is about trying to give our patients the best possible outcome. And that includes monitoring stimulation of the ovaries in the IVF treatment cycle, retrieving the eggs, inseminating them, having those embryos cultured in our laboratory for 6 days while they're developing to the point where they can be biopsied for genetic testing. And so we take great pride in our state-of-the-art IVF laboratory. That I think is a very, very important factor here in giving patients the best possible quality embryos and the best possible pregnancy outcomes.
No, absolutely. So ideally, if intended parents can travel to you in California to do the entire cycle, that is going to give them the best chances and the most optimized outcome.
It would be the most ideal.
Okay, fantastic. And are you able to talk us through a little bit more about how that process actually works?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
So in an IVF treatment cycle, generally medication starts on the second day of the menstrual cycle. We do an ultrasound of the ovaries to visualize all the follicles that have been recruited for that month. And hormone injections are started, follicle stimulating hormone. And this hormone stimulates the development of all those recruited follicles, all those recruited eggs. From the start of injections to egg retrieval is usually about 11 to 12 days. So we do serial ultrasounds 4 days after the first injection, and then every 2 to 3 days to monitor the growth of the follicles so that we can determine when the eggs are ready for retrieval. So if a patient needed to spend less time in the US, they could start medication in the UK, have their first ultrasound, start injections, have an ultrasound 4 days later, and then travel to Los Angeles to shorten their stay. The egg retrieval is a very short, 20-minute outpatient surgical procedure. It's done in the operating room down the hall where I'm sitting. It takes about 20 minutes. The day of egg retrieval, we'll either obtain a fresh semen sample or thaw a vial of frozen sperm to inseminate those eggs. A normal fertilization rate is about 75%. So the day after egg retrieval is a fertilized egg or one cell embryo. The next phase in IVF involves keeping them in culture for 6 days to watch them grow and develop. And between day 1 and days 5 to day 6, about 60 to 70% of those one cell embryos will grow into a sphere of over 100 cells called a blastocyst. And I think we have an image of them and some slides.
Absolutely.
Sent over. Are those easy to pull up?
There we go.
We go to the next slide. Here's our IVF laboratory. The next slide.
Beautiful.
So these are photographs of actual blastocysts. So this is a sphere of over 100 cells. The outer layer of the blastocysts are the future placental cells. And on the inside is a cluster of cells. You see in some photographs more strikingly than the others, is a bundle of cells that will become the actual fetal tissue. So when we do biopsy for genetic testing, we're removing 3 to 6 cells from the outer layer of the embryo, the future placental cells. The embryos are immediately frozen. The cells go to the genetics lab and they'll tell us whether or not that embryo has the correct number of chromosomes. And in women of all ages, a percentage of the eggs, a percentage of the embryos will be abnormal. And there's a direct correlation between age and the percent that are abnormal. So that in our 25-year-old egg donors, 30 to 40% will be abnormal. By age 35, 50% are abnormal. And by age 40, about 65, 70% will be abnormal. So by identifying which embryos have the correct number of chromosomes and which ones are abnormal, allows us to only transfer the normals and achieve a higher pregnancy rate. So all the embryos are crated and they're frozen and they're stored until we have the surrogate ready for an embryo transfer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's so helpful to see I'm quite a visual learner, so actually being able to see the blastocyst in its different stages and understand how it develops is incredibly helpful. So thank you for explaining that.
And we always try to develop as many blastocysts as we can because it gives us more opportunity for pregnancy, of course.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Right. Let me, let me just shift back here. All right, fantastic. So Natalie, I don't mean to ignore you. I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit. So obviously creating embryos is one of the first stages of anybody's surrogacy journey. Now, presuming that our wonderful British intended parents are going to be doing this journey in the US, have gone to Dr. Ringler in California to be creating embryos. Obviously, most parents, well, I guess I should say this, at what stage should British intended parents start considering the British legal implications for doing surrogacy in the US?
I mean, I guess it's all part of the planning the process and understanding the kind of whole picture of everything that you're going to need to deal with. So I would say the overwhelming majority of the parents that we work with come to us while they're in the planning stages, often when they're in the process of, if not creating embryos, but even earlier than that, kind of choosing the professionals that they're going to work with in the States. And it's not that from a UK legal perspective, you need to do anything in particular at the beginning, but it's just really about understanding that whole picture. So from a UK perspective, there's kind of work that has to be done in particular after the birth. So even if you go to the States and everything there in terms of the legal side of things is tied up so that you're recognised as the legal parents of your child from birth, unfortunately, UK law doesn't recognise that automatically. So there's also a court process that you have to go through after the birth. So even though you're not following that process until that stage, actually you kind of need to know, well, what's involved? Am I going to be eligible to make that application? If not, is there an alternative strategy? What can I do along the way to gather information and make sure I'm making choices so that I'm going to be able to kind of satisfy the court on all the things that are going to be as assessed in as easy a way as possible. So I think it's worth being really well informed and getting a bit of advice at the beginning, even if the actual kind of work around the legal stuff follows a bit further down the line.
Okay, fantastic. So come to you as early as possible. Which is just to understand, because I mean, again, as an intended parent myself, I know that having full disclosure spoken with you prior to starting our own journey, Natalie, was just so helpful in understanding how a lot of the choices that we were going to make in our own personal journey would have kind of a knock-on effect. So it's very similar to choosing the right, choosing the right clinic to make sure that you are having the state-of-the-art cycle to have the best chance of success. It's understanding those legal implications to make sure that you're crossing all your T's and dotting all of your I's early on in the process to help keep you informed. Is that right?
Okay. And it's a bit like Dr. Ringler saying you want the optimal kind of situation in terms of the embryos. It's the same with the legal side. So, if you have all that information before you've made hard choices, if it's going to impact whether you need a surrogate who's married or not, what state you go to, what needs to go on the court order or the birth certificate, whether you use a donor egg, donor sperm, both, these are all things that you can make those choices then with your eyes open in terms of what the legal implications are. And it's worth saying as well that where I was talking about the UK doesn't necessarily recognise automatically the legal position in the States, the same is true in lots of other countries as well. So if, we work with many, many parents who are connected with multiple countries where, they might be living in the UK, but they might have European nationalities and doing surrogacy in the States. And you need to, if it's important to you that your children are going to have citizenship of those countries, or if you might live in those countries in the future, you need to understand what the legal requirements are in each of those places. And again, that's all about the planning, because you might find, from a UK perspective, it doesn't matter which state you go to or whether your surrogate's married, but maybe in Germany it really does. So just having all that information so how is the law going to apply to me in all these different places with which I'm connected. It just enables you to set that optimal environment and making the best choices to, make things as easy for yourself as possible further down the line. And I think also not having that shock of, I'll deal with it later. And then, you find out once you're already pregnant that you've got this whole legal process to go through, and it comes as a bit of a shock. So I think certainly for me, I'm a planner. I would want to know what's everything I have to do, not necessarily all the detail, but just in general, what's the big picture. So I think, planning carefully is really important.
Absolutely. And as you say, the last thing that you want to be doing is, being in the middle of, hopefully your pregnancy or with your surrogate and forming that relationship and making all these wonderful plans, and then realize that there's a significant legal process that comes afterwards. So I am going to ask you to walk us through the parental order process in just a second, but actually you brought up something which it reminded me of, is actually another question to go back to Dr. Ringler. So Natalie, you were talking about understanding how your choices in choosing your surrogate and potentially even your egg donor would impact some of those legal processes for intended parents. Obviously, choosing your surrogate and an egg donor is also really important from a clinical perspective. Dr. Ringler, would you be able to share a little bit more about how you decide on or choose who is a good egg donor, who is a good surrogate, what criteria you look for, and how that criteria is chosen?
Sure, that's a great question. Fortunately, in the United States, there are many, many, thousands of candidates for egg donation. So I always tell my patients, you should really search until you find an egg donor that you really respond to, that you feel really good about, you're really excited about. There are literally thousands of candidates and many different sources for egg donors in the U.S. From the medical perspective, I want to make sure that the egg donor is going to make a sufficient number of eggs so we end up with enough embryos to give them multiple options for pregnancy. The response of the ovaries in women varies greatly from patient to patient. So some 25-year-old egg donors may make 10 eggs, another may make 30 eggs. I always want to make sure we have enough eggs, enough embryos to give them several chances of a pregnancy. So how do we assess this? By tests of ovarian reserve. There's a blood test called anti-Mullerian hormone that correlates well with egg production. An ultrasound of the ovaries at the beginning of the cycle to measure the number of follicles recruited is called the antral follicle count, is another excellent assessment of ovarian reserve. We need to test them genetically to make sure that the egg provider, sperm provider don't share any mutations for recessive genetic diseases. So you always want to make sure you're, a good genetic match before making final selection of your egg donor. And I always offer to my patients that I am happy to review the records, the profiles of their egg donor candidates before they make a final decision to make sure she's going to be a good candidate medically for the experience. For surrogacy, surrogates are very well screened by the surrogacy agencies as to their past reproductive histories, prior pregnancy histories. Once the patients, intended parents, are matched with the surrogate through their agency, the agency will send me all the prior pregnancy records. And what I'm looking for is to make sure that all the prior pregnancies were normal and not high risk in any way. The goal for surrogacy is to provide this optimal environment for conception and for carrying the pregnancy for term. So we want the pregnancy to be safe, uncomplicated. So we want to minimize any pregnancy risk by working with candidates with a completely normal past pregnancy, normal past medical history, to optimize outcome for the patients.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Natalie, going back to you, you mentioned that some intended parents, particularly British intended parents, might want to look for an unmarried surrogate or might want to prefer to be matched with an unmarried surrogate. Could you just share a little bit about why that is and if there are any other legal criteria that you would suggest? I mean, obviously every intended parent is different, as you said, but any other legal criteria that intended parents should keep in mind on top of the clinical criteria that Dr. Ringler just discussed?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the surrogate's marital status is often actually less significant than people think, but it is a different situation in terms of what that means in the UK. So just to explain how this works. So the surrogate in the UK who gives birth is always treated as the legal mother. If she's married, then her husband is treated, or her wife is treated, as the father or other parent. And in that situation, it means that neither of the intended parents is recognised as their child's legal parents for UK law purposes at birth. So they go through this court process in the UK to become the parents of their child. But until they get that parental order, they won't be recognised as parents in the UK. Whereas if the surrogate's not married, then the biological father is recognised for certain purposes under UK law as being the legal father. So that then there's a different scenario, which is that one of the intended parents, whether that's half of a same-sex couple or whether that's the father in a different sex relationship, is recognised as a parent from birth from the UK's perspective. And the biggest impact that has is in terms of nationality. So if your child's born in the States, you're bringing them back to the UK and then applying for your parental order. It's about what the situation is when you travel home. So the reason it's kind of whether you choose a surrogate who's married or not is often less significant than people think, is that you have the alternative option of traveling using your child's US passport. And every child who's born in the States is automatically an American citizen. And in practice, that's what most parents do. But if you do have an unmarried surrogate, then you also have the option of applying for a British passport, assuming the biological father has got the right kind of British nationality. And this is where it's a little bit case specific. So again, it's all about kind of planning. You know, does it matter to you whether you can get a British passport straight away, or are you happy to travel on the US passport and wait to do that? Obviously, if you're going to restrict your choice of surrogate, that might increase your match time. So this is all about kind of weighing up those choices. But sometimes there are situations where it really does matter. So if for any reason you can't get a parental order, or perhaps you have, as I was talking about before, a nationality of another country where the law requires the surrogate to be unmarried, you know, there may be reasons why you would need to choose your surrogate's marital status to be in a particular category. So that's really the main thing in terms of those sort of choices at the beginning. But I guess the other thing in terms of legal requirements to understand is whether you're going to be eligible to make that application for a parental order. And if not, what's the backup plan and what situation does that leave you in? And the two main situations where people wouldn't qualify for a parental order is if they don't have a biological connection with their child. So if you're conceiving with donor eggs and donor sperm and a surrogate, then you're going to be kind of pushed out of the categories of patients that are able to apply for that parental order. And we actually did a case a couple of years ago now, which was the very first case where the court granted an adoption order in favour of a single mum who'd done surrogacy in the States with donor eggs and donor sperm. So that was a kind of workaround, and we've now kind of established that that's possible, but it's a completely different process to go through. So if you're in that category, you kind of need to understand what's involved with that. The other scenario where parents may not qualify for a parental order is if they're not domiciled in the UK. And domicile is a bit of a weird, tricky concept, but you can be living in the UK but not be domiciled here. You can also be living somewhere else and be domiciled in the UK. So it's about kind of looking at your history and your roots and, you know, where you come in your life in terms of where you started and where you're living now. So again, if you've got foreign connections, you were born somewhere else or you're living outside the UK, that's something you need quite careful advice around in terms of, are we going to qualify for a parental order? And if not, what other options are available to us?
Okay. So again, a good reason to connect with you and your team early enough to understand what that process is going to be. Now, assuming...
I was just going to say, Natalie, make this sound so simple. That's why I always like having you on my team, because I know everything's going to be planned out and go very smoothly.
When I start talking about domicile, you sort of see everybody glaze over as these archaic legal concepts.
Yeah. I always like, if I know surrogacy is going to be involved at the time of the initial consultation, I always like to refer my patients to a reproductive attorney to get them started in the beginning to help guide them through the process, because it really takes a team of professionals to make these cases go smoothly.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ringler, you've just brought up one of the questions that I was going to ask, and that is and this is to both of you, and Dr. Ringler, you can go first. Obviously, there are a number of professionals that are required, not just for British intended parents, but for any intended parents, and especially international intended parents. There's kind of that extra layer of professional attentiveness and care that's needed. How do you recommend intended parents choose their clinic, their agency, their attorney? Obviously, those are three quite intrinsic parts of any surrogacy journey, and that's not to exclude anybody else. What are your recommendations for how people go about choosing their team?
I think you want to start with an IVF clinic with a long history of experience of excellence in IVF. You want to work with a clinic that does surrogacy, because these cases are complicated, sort of puzzle-like, and all the pieces are very important. You want to make sure your clinic has years of experience doing surrogacy cases. You want to work with an IVF clinic with a very successful, respected IVF laboratory, because the laboratory is providing the environment in which your embryos grow, and it can have a significant impact on the number of embryos formed, on the quality of those embryos, and ultimately your success rate. So, we're fortunate we have a very successful IVF laboratory staffed by senior embryologists that do amazing work. So I know I work very hard to get the ovaries to respond well, to get as many eggs to develop and the highest quality eggs to give to my IVF laboratory. And I know they'll be beautiful work once they get there. So I think you should ask about the IVF laboratory, ask about their success rates. And then lastly, you really want to work with people that you feel comfortable with, that you can entrust your care to. So you want a team of committed professionals that are going to support you throughout the treatment process. And if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, you want to make sure that you're receiving your care in an LGBTQ friendly environment.
Thank you. Those are all fantastic points for parents to consider. Natalie, what would your recommendations be?
With all of that, and also in addition, I think can feel quite overwhelming when you're planning a surrogacy journey, because you need to choose a clinic, and you need to choose an attorney, and you need to choose an agency, and you need to think about the law in different places. And it's like, where do we start? Who do we talk to? How do we pull all the pieces together and make sure that we're not missing anything? So I think it's really important to take the time and do your research really carefully. And it can be really difficult from parents, I think, particularly outside the US, where if you're just kind of Googling and looking at people's websites, it's very difficult to know whether, how long agencies have been around and whether they really do what they say, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think, spending your time and talking to lots of people. One of the reasons we set up the US surrogacy pathway that we offer through Brilliant Beginnings was precisely because of this issue that parents just kind of didn't know who to trust, didn't know where to start. So we, as a kind of team, are always kind of keeping our ears to the ground and, building relationships with a range of different agencies and attorneys and clinics that we know are kind of right at the top tier for US in terms of quality and experience. And we're kind of always looking for the ones that have, lots of experience, not just doing surrogacy, but working with international parents. And it can be really little things sometimes that can make a journey feel comfortable or not. Is your agency used to dealing with people in a different time zone, or is just no one ever available when you're available? There are kind of so many small things. And I think it's also a really personal decision. There are some organizations that are very efficient and, quite commercial in their approach. And some people really like that. There are others that are kind of, more warm, perhaps smaller and more personal. So I think it is about what's your communication style. The people that you're working with on this surrogacy journey, firstly, you're entrusting your future child into their processes and their protocols. And that's the most precious thing ever. But also they're all going to be in your life for, there's going to be so many people involved in the conception of this child. And you're going to be talking to lots of different people, and you don't want that communication to feel difficult or uncomfortable or, to cause more anxiety than needs to be in the process anyway. So I think not rushing into things, but choosing carefully and getting good advice to kind of guide you. Again, I keep coming back to this, don't I, about it's all in the planning. But I do think, the great thing about the States is there's loads of choice, but then that's also the challenge. There's almost too much choice. So kind of trying to work through, lots of people talk to other people who've been through the journey for recommendations and that kind of thing. But getting current knowledge can be a bit challenging sometimes because things do change. And if you're talking to other parents, they've been through the journey a good few years ago, probably. So, I think it is one of the challenges, but I think go slow, do your research, kind of trust your instincts and find out as much as you can.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for those insights. So now our wonderful intended parents have chosen, based on that advice, their agency, they've chosen their clinic, they've made, chosen their egg donor, made their wonderful eggs, made their wonderful embryos, have a surrogate who meets all of that criteria. Surrogate is pregnant, gives birth. Natalie, how do intended parents get back to the UK? What does that parental order process look like? Can you talk us through that very, very briefly?
Yeah, so I guess the first step when the baby's born is to get the US birth certificate. So the process for that will depend on the state in which your child is born, but you should have a very good US attorney who will help make sure that all happens quickly and smoothly. Lots of states have pre-birth orders, so it's all kind of set up in advance of the birth, so it can happen very quickly afterwards. Once you've got your child's US birth certificate, you can then apply for their US passport. And that's the document that you need to travel if you want to come home as quickly as possible. Now, you may, when you come back, get a bit of a conversation at the border and have to kind of explain your circumstances. We've never had any families denied entry at the border, but technically your child's coming in ostensibly as a visitor, but they're not coming as a visitor, they're coming to stay. So you may need to kind of explain that. But once you then come back to the UK, and usually parents are back, within, say, 2 to 4 weeks after the birth, or some people extend their stay for a bit longer, but it's not a hugely kind of long stay after the birth. And then you'll be kind of obviously focused on dealing with the UK legal process. And when we're working with parents, typically we've already started getting ready for that, so we can get the application underway, sometimes even before people have come back from the States. And the process itself will take between 5 and 8 months currently to get from sending your application to the court to your court hearing. And these are applications which go to a small number of specialist surrogacy judges in the High Court. So you'll have your final court hearing at the Royal Courts of Justice in London, which is all very grand. I took my daughter there once and she was convinced it was Hogwarts. So, but the good thing about the fact that it goes to these High Court judges is that they have a lot of experience of dealing with surrogacy cases. So at the moment, there's about 90 to 100 US surrogacies going through the court each year. And all of those cases are heard by those same 3 or 4 judges. So they've seen lots of other US cases. They also see surrogacy cases from other jurisdictions where there might be more significant concerns around the ethics of things and so on. So generally, US cases are at the more comfortable end. The courts are applying law which is dates back to 1990, so it really wasn't set up kind of for dealing with this kind of modern situation. But the judges have been our friends over the last 15 years by making those criteria fit to get to the outcome of this order that's going to safeguard a child for the rest of their life. So the judges, everybody knows some of the rules are a bit, ridiculous in some ways, but we are all kind of working together to get to the same outcome. So it's certainly not a process to feel too daunted by. But because the judges are applying that kind of very old legislation, there's a lot of information you have to present. It's not just, we've been through US surrogacy and here's our birth certificate. So there's a whole list of things you have to show around relationship criteria, and biological connection, and that your child having their home with you. The surrogate has to give her consent and her spouse as well. And then there's a whole exercise that happens around authorising the payments, because the law in the UK is set up to discourage commercial surrogacy. But of course, in most US surrogacy arrangements, you're paying compensation to a surrogate and you're also paying a fee to a profit-making agency. So the court has to retrospectively authorise that. So you have to provide evidence to show a detailed breakdown of the finances, and you also have to give some reassurance that the arrangement was ethical, the surrogate wasn't exploited, no one was taken advantage of, that you haven't deceived the authorities and so on. And again, working with reputable professionals in the US, none of that is difficult, but you do need to give all of that information. And I think if there is a risk in the process, it's less that the order will be denied and more that the judge will say, I haven't got enough information about X or Y, and you need to go away and gather that and present me with another statement. And then it just extends the process and you have more hearings. So I think, where we're working with parents, what we're trying to do is foresee and avoid all of those pitfalls, provide all the information really thoroughly so that when you get to that court hearing, I always say that I'm aiming to stand up in court and say, judge, have you read the bundle? And the judge says, yes, it's answered all my questions, sit down again. And then they make the order and we have some photos. That's that's the plan.
That sounds like a lovely day in court.
Yeah. But it is, it's all in the art of kind of preparing the case and giving all of that information. And I think knowing the judges and knowing what they'll expect, and they all have a slightly different style. So it's kind of helpful to have that knowledge. But it's the bit that kind of comes last at the end of the process. And I think lots of parents understandably feel a bit frustrated that it's necessary at all, which I completely understand and we completely agree with. But the judges are, as I've said, very supportive. They want to make these orders. And actually, sometimes when you go to that final hearing, we very often find parents get quite emotional, and sometimes I get quite emotional too, because it is like that final moment of closure and that moment of, you've been through this really long journey and now you're properly recognised as a family in your home country. And, we celebrate that and we acknowledge the difficulty that you had getting here. And it can be quite moving.
Oh, that's
what a great success story. I'm just thinking these babies are so loved, right? All the effort that's gone into making it happen. It's really pretty incredible.
Yeah. Definitely. There's one of the judges actually who does a little thing sometimes where if he has a number of surrogacy cases on his list on the same morning, he brings everybody into court together and he does a little thing about how these are all miracle babies and he wanted them to all see that they're not alone and that there are other families like theirs. So it's very nice.
Oh, that's lovely. And Dr. Ringler, you are so right. It's the all of these wonderful babies who are born through surrogacy. It is such a team effort. So many people have been intrinsically involved in getting them here, and it's I hope I'm a parent through surrogacy, and my son is just starting to kind of understand it all, but I can't wait for him to know how many people were involved and loved him before he got here and moved mountains to try and get him here and get him here safe and get back to the UK. So it's absolutely wonderful, and it's such a celebratory occasion to be able to go to court and recognize that and have that affirmed kind of in front of everybody. It might, I think, for some intended parents, as you say, their baby's already here. It seems like it's an extra step, but it's quite nice to have that recognition and that recognition spoken and recognized. Natalie, just really briefly before we wrap everything up, because I appreciate that I've taken up so much of your time, because it's wonderful to speak with you both. You had briefly mentioned how relatively archaic, although I guess in British terms, not necessarily hugely archaic, but how outdated some of these laws are for intended parents in the UK. There's obviously a Law Commission review. Could you just briefly share what that was about and how that may or may not impact any intended parents moving forward over the next year or so?
Sure, and there's a lot to say on that as well. I mean,
Yeah.
So the Law Commission was tasked with reviewing the law to see if it should be brought up to date and then giving a report to the government with recommendations. And they started this project in 2018 and they kept pushing back the date for their report. They did a huge amount of work, talked to a huge amount of people. And ultimately, in March last year, it's just nearly a year old, they produced their 607-page final report with recommendations. So there's a lot of recommendations in there. And there are some positive things around surrogacy in the UK. But overall, we were quite disappointed that they weren't a little bit braver in terms of changing that kind of dynamic around people going overseas for surrogacy. So essentially and disappointingly, if parents do go abroad for surrogacy, they will continue to have to follow this process of the parental order in order to become their child's legal parents. At one stage of the kind of consideration, they talked about potentially recognising certain overseas surrogacy arrangements automatically, but ultimately the Law Commission decided that they wouldn't feel comfortable with recommending that for any commercial surrogacy arrangements, and essentially that's all international surrogacy arrangements. Yeah. So even if these changes take effect, which at the moment we don't even know if that's going to happen because the current government have said they don't have parliamentary time to devote to it before the election, so it will kind of flip over to a decision to be made by the next government, and who knows in terms of priorities and lots of other things post-election that I'm sure need dealing with. So the changes might never happen, but if they happen in their current form, it's not going to make any change in terms of US surrogacy, unfortunately. But we will continue lobbying for changes of mind on that, and to make things kind of more straightforward. And I think there's lots that can be done, even if there isn't automatic recognition. We could make the parental order process pre-birth, we could make it much quicker, much more straightforward. So we will continue to push for that. But at the moment, it's not looking like anything's going to change anytime soon.
Okay, which is disappointing, but I guess it's beneficial that that the process is going to be as it was and as everybody's kind of familiar with. If you can, I guess, see any good side to these changes not being made.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the good thing is it's not a step backwards. I mean, and you see things that are happening in places like Italy where they're trying to kind of stop people going for surrogacy. So at least it's maintain the status quo and not kind of make things more difficult. But we were hopeful that things would move forward. So yes, we'll keep pushing.
We'll continue to hope, continue to advocate, continue to talk about what a wonderful process this can be when it's done ethically and with the best providers. And so just to kind of round up, obviously both of you have such incredible experience in this field. I have worked with so many intended parents over a number of years from the UK, from lots of different countries, in your case, Dr. Ringler. If you had one piece of advice to give to British or overseas parents who are about to embark on this journey, what would your one piece of advice be? Dr. Ringler, we'll start with you, if that's okay.
That's hard to narrow it down to one.
No, sorry. I'll give you two. You can have two pieces of
I think my one piece of advice is to put together your best team for you, your best the reproductive attorney you feel very comfortable with, the IVF clinic where you feel very comfortable with, and you feel like you have a good source of communication where you feel respected. Because this is a very important chapter of your lives. It's a costly adventure. It's very emotional. You want to work with a team of professionals that you feel really comfortable with and good about, to make it a pleasurable and rewarding experience as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's so important. There's so much that goes into it, so much, as you say, financial outlay, so much time, so much effort on everybody's part. You want to surround yourself by a team that is going to uplift you and make you remember the positives rather than all the paperwork that you have to do. So thank you for that. And Natalie, what's the one piece of advice that you could give to intended parents just starting out?
I expect you'd bet that I'd say do your homework and do your planning at the start, and I will say that. But I think also have faith that it can work. I think we will work with lots of people right at the beginning of their journeys where they might have had a very difficult journey before this point, or maybe they're in a same-sex relationship and they didn't think it would ever be possible to have children, and it can feel like it's so far away from you and so untouchable. But we work with families every day, for whom this has worked and they've had children. So I think just, have that leap of faith and know that, if you do set things up in the right way, you can have success, and just, have some courage and believe in the process.
Yeah, I love that. Keep the faith, keep the hope alive. And it's a process that's worked for thousands of people. And you guys have been an intrinsic part of that. So thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, your knowledge, your wisdom with us. I really appreciate it. It's always a privilege to speak with both of you. So on behalf of Family Source Consultants, thank you so much. And for any intended parents out there who are starting their journey or in the midst of their journey and would like any advice, please feel free to contact any of us. We will have Dr. Ringler and Natalie's information available if you would like to speak with either of them and gain their expertise and wisdom as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice to see you, Natalie.
You too.